All right. It is 1:30. Do we want to wait a little longer to see if Jen's gonna make it, or do we want to get going?
He can catch up.
Oh, he's right here.
Okay.
Anyway.
He is.
Perfectly on time.
Good.
Good, Andrew. You sound
All right.
So we're recording. And so for posterity, and so for all of the folks who decide to view the recording, why don't we just go around the room and introduce ourselves? Since we don't have, Dan Caplan's the only one with a little name in his Zoom square. So kick it off, Sky.
I'm Sky Salati. I'm the director of planning here in Topsham. I think I've met everyone here, though I haven't seen you in quite a while, so it's nice to see you again.
I'm Pete Bono, I'm with CPIC. And glad I'm here. Glad you're here too. Joe Bailey, CPIC.
Pam Belford, CPIC. Susan Ray Reeves.
Andy Sturgeon, I'm here in the capacity as CPIC member and also as chair of the TDI Development Board. TDI Inc., which is kind of the economic development arm of the town of Topsham right now. Absence of a full-time economic development director. And I also represent some of the developers in the area from an engineering and land use standpoint.
Anything else?
Full disclosure, I have a license, real estate license at Don's office, insurance license at Brown and Brown, and a land surveyor's license at Boylston.
And he's retired.
And I'm retired.
Don Span, chair of the planning board.
Chris Blanger, I'm an engineer locally to the area. I do not live in Topsham itself. But I got a couple clients that asked me to show up and provide input.
I'm Kurt Neufeld. I'm a civil engineer working with Priority Real Estate Group, Topsham resident. I am also a member of the Topsham Development Inc., TDI.
Jim Howard, president of Priority Group, real estate developer.
Dan's camera's working.
So who are you, Dan?
Oh, there.
Hey, Dan Catlin, and I'm a resident of Harpswell, but I sit on TDI and I'm a developer in the area.
Okay, so this session kind of follows 3 or 4 office hours sessions where various folks met with us, sometimes with the consultants and sometimes not, to offer general and more helpfully feedback on specific parts of the ReCode draft. And we're getting ready to wrap that draft up. Hello, come on in. Dave
Yes,
Coleman,
yes,
yes. Would you mind we've just gone around to introduce ourselves?
Sure.
As you settle yourself into.
yes,
Because we're being recorded.
yes.
We're just kind of getting started. For the people who don't have a name tag or anything, just let folks know who view the recording after the fact, who you are.
Sure. I'm Dave Holman. I live in North Yarmouth. I've worked in Brunswick and Topsham for a long time in real estate. I'm an agent at Remax Riverside, doing mostly commercial work there. I co-own a property management company called Katahdin Property Management. And then I'm another hat just to keep myself busy is as a developer. So we built the Sandpiper building in Brunswick, and we're doing due diligence to see if we can do something similar here in Topsham.
Okay, so this kind of wraps up the draft. That's the first public draft. It's been kicking around for a while. It was put out just in time for this year's town meeting. And we've had comment on it in a number of ways. And it's gonna go off to the consultants and produce clean, new draft for us to deal with. But what we wanted to do today, and thanks so much everybody for coming, is hear from you about, you gave various kinds of feedback on this draft. And it's actually been incorporated in this draft. What does it look like? So that we can give further revisions. Thanks, Kurt. If further revisions are warranted, you know, we can have conversations with the consultants. You know, you can have the discussion right here, but we can also take that away and have it considered. We want to make sure that this is going to be, the next draft is going to be an even better product for our town. We knew that big changes were needed, and we want to get it right. And the folks who are using the code all the time are folks who have been very helpful in giving us some feedback. So I don't care where we start. Do you have any thoughts?
I just want to say one thing, for everybody's benefit, I sent you a link to the town website. It had links to this document. This document has a date of April 2024, but it has been updated since April.
No, it has not.
Okay, so
It's been commented on upside down and sideways, but it has not been revised.
so April 2024 was after all our other meetings and
Mhm.
after the changes that that
Yep.
they requested.
Yep.
Either didn't get in or did get in
Correct.
for whatever reason, so I just wanted to make sure there was clarity on.
Yep.
This version, because it's been a long time and
It has been.
in you know, remembering dates and red lines, but this document is actually red line too.
There's
There
two
were-
versions.
There are two versions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a red line and a non-red line version.
Right, both of those links, I think, were right on the website, so.
We're
just
trying to
wanna
make
sure
it as
that-
transparent as possible.
Just wanted to qualify that, so, again, I think what we should do is turn it over to, Jim, Kurt, Chris. And see what they have for comments, but in general, I keep hearing the comment, 184 pages. And why is it that large, so I'm just prefacing, I forgot you, Dan. Just prefacing that statement with, what I keep hearing.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I don't have an answer for that, but I wanted.
I did use my vacation time this week to sit down and read it all and take notes, so I just want.
Why don't you kick it off then, Jim?
Well, let me just ask the question, does anybody know how many pages our current code is?
It's sizable.
I mean, this is 184 pages, is it a lot longer? But is it comparable?
I would think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have exact numbers, so I'm hesitating to get it,
Yeah.
but I don't even have a full printout of the current one because it's so big, Tom does. And I can't imagine that it's a whole lot bigger. I will say that I think there's some different formatting going on here that could potentially influence. I feel like it's slightly larger text, easier to read. Our current code is a little difficult if you get into the whole thing. I think that this represents a condensing of a lot of the things that are currently in the code. There's things coming out. Of course, there are being things added, but while of course that is a helpful comment to have, I think we're working on it. I guess is what I'd say.
So does this replace the whole code?
Just chapter 225.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
so there's a
yes.
whole, so when you say there's 184 pages, then there's still the code
Yes.
Well, there's.
for everything else in town. This just represents the area that you're working.
This is just
Yeah.
chapter 225.
Okay, so chapter 225 today, how big is that? Is that what you're commenting
Yes.
on?
Yes.
Okay, so you're saying it's comparable?
I would say so.
Okay.
I did not know that. That's-
There's a lot of sections in like a special section area.
I wonder how much if we were to take out the charts, for example, and the other illustrations, my guess is that takes up a lot of room. In other words, if we were comparing text to text, it probably represents a significant.
Yeah, not too many charts.
There's some images
Yeah.
and the Topsham Center zones have their stuff, but I mean, I would say that I think that that's that's a helpful comment, and I don't intend to ignore it or anything like that, you know, I don't want that to sound like, oh, no, it's, you know. This is good, you know,
By font size too,
Yeah.
you know.
I think that I wanna consider, I hadn't thought about that in such a way, but,
And I'm not asking for an accounting of it, I'm just referencing that I often hear.
Okay. Now, why don't we get into some of the specifics, because I know, you know, folks gave a lot of very helpful feedback. And, you know, quite a few revisions were made, both in the NPD and related to drive-throughs, all kinds of things, so I'm not sure who else besides you, Jim, has taken the time to review it and sort of pinpoint some notes. Maybe Dave has, I don't know, Kurt, but anybody who wants to sort of pick a starting point, we're here to hear what you think has been done in response to your questions and concerns.
I would say a couple things, before spending a little bit more time doing a deep dive. I don't know, 2 months ago, Chris and I had met, and I spent some time looking at how would it work if we were trying to develop something in the Topsham Fair Mall with this code. In particular, I looked at the Pub 99, but this would also apply with some of those others, the Sherwin-Williams building and some of that area. And the comments I had with that, one, even just trying to figure out, well, what building would the Pub 99 be if it were a standalone restaurant? And as best I could come up with, it was a suburban storefront.
Yeah.
So then I look at some of the requirements around suburban storefront. And one thing that's in there on that and a couple others are the street wall dimension.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be 55% of the lot frontage. Well, that particular lot is, I want to say 250 plus feet. So 55% of that would make for a very long and maybe presumably narrow building for the square feet they're looking at. And my first thought was we would be asking for a waiver for that. And that's true for a number of existing parcels along Topsham Fair Mall Road that have very long frontages. The one that Sherwin-Williams sits on, for example, the parcel goes down the hill to the stream. And so it's like 400 feet or something. Don't quote me on these numbers,
Yeah.
but they're very long. So I think the 55% minimum street wall can be problematic. I know that when the Brunswick Landing redevelopment code came about, there was similar minimum frontage requirements, and those have all been done away with because they were found to be fairly difficult. I think it probably worked well if you're in a very urban environment. I think this is a very urban code. So if you were in Cambridge, Mass, it would probably work out great because a lot of those, and maybe this is true in downtown Brunswick, where the lot lines and the building lines are the same. But where we're trying to, if we're looking at some existing land, I think that's problematic. I think that the requirement to have some of these restaurants right up on the sidewalk, it misses opportunities to have seating out front like they do at Kume and Firehouse Subs and some of those where you want to have a little bit of room there. And those kind of work with the parking out front, which unsurprisingly, I think resale businesses work well with at least a row of parking out front. I didn't really get an opportunity to talk to a fire chief about it, but I think that in terms of having customer access at the front door, ADA access near the front door, and emergency access, there's just things that get confounded if the code requires you to basically be right on the sidewalk. And I know, Chris, I don't want to speak for you, but we were talking about looking at opportunities across the street with a multi-use building that might have some residential. Again, if you were to have some patios, the requirement to be right up on the sidewalk, it just wasn't working well. For some of these others, if you're gonna have a building that wide and you had multi-tenanted buildings, which seems to be pushing everything to be multi-tenanted and a mix of residential, I guess that works. But I don't really think that's, well, it's not how we've been doing it.
You've actually covered a lot of ground
Okay,
with your comments.
Yeah.
And what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is, because I do think the weeds are where the work happens, right? And I'm not an expert, but we're all trying to be part of this learning curve, and you're talking about the commercial mixed use zone. And there are a number of buildings that are allowed there, right? The traditional storefront building, the suburban storefront building, the general building, and the row building. Okay, all of those are allowed. So why don't we get into the dimensional requirements there?
Okay.
And see if any of that allows you to do what you want to do. And I'm gonna rely a little bit here on Sky to guide us into some of this. I'm just looking at, well, I'm looking at page 2 dash, yeah, we're giving some of the new names. Oh, not all of them, just some of them.
So just a question, and I did not have time to go through this latest version.
Yeah.
But he was talking, I think, what you're calling TF1, and my position on TF1, TF2, right?
We've heard it a few
changed-
times, Don.
Right, so I'm not gonna go into that, but you mentioned a different zone, is that the
Yeah.
same as this?
It's the
TF1?
commercial mixed use zone
Yes.
is what we're calling Thompson Fair Mall 1. That's, if you look at the code,
Just
that's
wanted
what
to,
it's
just
called.
wanted to ask.
Yeah, yeah.
Good.
And so, you look at some of the charts, and the chart that deals with, it's both lower village, upper village.
That's fine, I just wanted to clarify that that is still TF1.
Yeah.
That's fine.
And commercial mixed use and mixed transitional is what we were calling Thompson Fair Mall 2. I'm looking at page 2-13. Am I in the right spot, Sky?
That is where the requirements for traditional storefront in mine are.
Okay. So, because, what has happened in a few occasions is we're very concerned. And then, hi, Marilyn, and then what we end up hearing is, that there is actually more flexibility than you think. So why don't we look at, so you're looking at street and courtyard facade, no, we don't care about transparency. Street front wall. Right, is that where we should be looking, Sky?
Yes, so that's what I believe Kurt was bringing up as an issue with
Yep.
the suburban storefront
Yeah.
building.
and the traditional storefront's even worse and more required stringent, 75%
Right,
of that building.
right,
And again, trying to retrofit that with large lots will be problematic.
right,
And what am I pointing out isn't to pick apart the code, is to
Yeah.
say,
no, it's the workability.
a lot of the times, I'll use Brunswick, pick on them for a moment. They have requirements to survey all the trees that are 10 inches or diameter above. And I've waived that at every job I've done. And so why introduce something into a new code if we're gonna wind up waiving a lot? So that's what I wanna.
No, and that's exactly, this is the kind of feedback that's helpful. You don't wanna put something in that ends up being discarded.
So other things that I just. Again, if I look at the traditional storefront, we're looking at that or the other one, it talks about having building segments.
Yeah.
You gotta have a certain number of entrances for the segments along there. And as I read this, it seemed like that doesn't lend itself to a single use building. So if there's one of the restaurants, such as an Olive Garden or a steakhouse or something comes down, they're probably not gonna wanna share building with something.
Right,
The suburban storefront, and again, I'm kind of looking at the pictures, those were helpful. Those seem to be lended a little bit more to that. So that's got the 55-foot minimum street wall requirement.
right,
Um,
2-15.
and so if that building, if we took the street front out of it and said it's gonna be 100 by 100 building, say. It looks like you'd wanna have a couple segments. And it would say one entrance is required for every 2 building segments. But as a restaurant, they probably wanna have one entrance to bring you to the hostess station. It's not working well. And again, the other thing, I don't wanna have stuff in there that we waive all the time. I don't wanna have something that would result in a business going, that doesn't work for me. What's Freeport got? You know, I'm on TDI. I'm really interested in economic development in this town.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want this to be the best thing to happen to Cook's Corner. And I'm being a little flippant, I apologize. The general building doesn't really apply at all, I don't think, to restaurants. It doesn't really have a street wall. So if I were to look at the same thing for Dan's building over there with Kume and Sherwin-Williams and some of those, probably works a little bit better in terms of the segmentation and the descriptions. But again, where I have concerns about how that would work, and I use the existing businesses, if you have a paint store and it's required to be right up on the sidewalk, then either your customers have to walk around the building to the front door. And then if you had service entrance or people who are gonna be loading in hand trucks full of paint, are they going, is there a back door? Do they have to go through the front door? A lot of these businesses that have a customer side and a service side, they work very well if you have parking on both sides. So.
Is there an allowance to, is this waivable under what we have or not?
I would say the question around waivability is a little difficult regarding, the fact that the county reviewed it and that was a concern with some things. And as a result, the consultants are looking back for waivability and how that fits in. Some of them will need to be, rather than a waiver, it'll be probably a maximum allowed if you meet certain requirements is what they're looking at right now. I think, the parking thing has come up quite a lot, and I think that probably does need to be discussed or looked at to some extent, because these are points that seem to keep coming up to me. But I can't say specifically on that one, I don't want to, with that being so up in the air.
But he did say that dimensional type stuff is less waivable.
Yes, yeah.
So the dimension was. I don't know if the dimension is for setback from the street line, but it's small, I think, in here. I don't know what the exact number is, but that's not waivable then. So the building has to be at the front. You have no.
He didn't say across the board, but he said if you were to determine what you could conceivably waiver and couldn't conceivably waiver, if it involved dimensions and dimension tables, probably that is something that should be waivable. That's the way he worded it. And that was not only this, it was on, there was a ReCode stuff.
Thank you, Don, I appreciate that.
So. This code is implementing a vision that came out of the comp plan, as I understand it. And I guess I've said this before, if the vision is a downtown like Brunswick or Bath or Camden, there's certain things about that style which is attractive, but it's also a couple hundred years out of date in terms of how people get to and from, stay and enjoy it. So they talk about some on-street parking. Well, if a building is 100 feet wide maybe 120, but you have parallel parking in front that are 22 feet each. And then you probably lose some because you want to have pedestrian bump outs. You might wind up with a building that's 100 feet wide that has 3 businesses and 4 parking spaces on the street, maybe 6. So then everybody's got to go out back and park. And I just wonder, Dan, maybe you know better than I do, talking to the folks, is that working well for people who have businesses on main streets?
No, it is not. That would be a deal killer. And, you know, I mean, look at the development that just went in with Market Basket. Can you imagine trying to put 450 spaces in the rear of that building? The retailers don't want the general public out in the rear of the building where they're taking all their deliveries. It just defies logic and is a safety hazard. So ideally, products get delivered to the rear of the building and then moved to the front of the building. Kurt, your example about Sharon Williams is a great one. You know, a lot of times every day there's a Sharon Williams truck at that back rear loading door. And they wouldn't want to mix the general public with that activity going through their warehouse. And the other thing that I'd say too, you brought up a good point about the units, and I had that in my notes here. I think it was like a 60 foot unit. Every unit needs 2 doors. I think there needs to be some language in there to take into consideration the retailer's floor plan. You guys that have done retail know that when those guys come forward, they drop a floor plan in that building footprint, and their circulation is very important. And your analogy of a larger restaurant having multiple doors, it makes it confusing because they don't want doors there that people aren't supposed to go to. They want one entrance that would go to a hostess station. So that was a kind of a good example. I'll tell you, we've got the US Cell over there that I just renewed, and that was one of their biggest complaints is that unit. It's got 2 doors, and the way they configured the store, you know, it's only for one entrance. That's where they want people coming in. So they constantly have people coming and pulling on the door. So anyway.
I think you might get a lot of use of the door signs.
Hey, you know, the other thing you mentioned, Kurt, about pulling the buildings forward, that's a direct conflict with all the interior traffic lanes that I actually credit Bruce Allen making everybody put in. And we were, you know, thinking that he had rocks in his head at the time he was doing it, but it took so much pressure off the intersections. And as our intersections, you know, start to get maxed out, think of the Tire Warehouse and the Pub 99 intersection or Park Drive intersection. Those interior roads make a huge dent in the interior traffic, which keeps the traffic numbers down. And some of those intersections, like the Hannaford intersection, that is problematic. If you have the interior driveways to travel on to make multiple trips, it keeps the numbers lower. If you look at the Tom Errico plan that I forget what year that was done, it's like 2005 or 7 or something like that. He calls for interior driveways to be placed from actually in front of Hannaford all the way down to the cancer center, going across the CMP right away, and thought that those were a big value. So obviously, if you pull the building forward, there's going to be a conflict there.
So Dan, you're talking about kind of travel lanes in a sense within the parking lots.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, this would divide different sections of the parking lot.
Right.
Gotcha.
And again, it's just, the main thing is you can't mix the retail store with what's getting delivered to the store. And as the footprint gets bigger, that problem gets worse.
I just. And I can't remember what part of the code that it's in. But as it relates to the Topsom Fair Mall section. In redevelopment of an existing building, if you're gonna redevelop an existing building or expand it at all. It looks like it reads that that expansion needs to comply with the new code. And the new standards that are in here, whether it's. More bicycle racks, or it's windows, or it's doors, or it's whatever it is.
Yeah.
So. I mean, has anybody selected a building in the Topsom Fair Mall and said, okay, so what if we
We were
add on to
hoping
this
would
building?
happen. True,
And,
true.
and what does that mean? How do you have one building with one set of design standards and the rest of your building without a set of, that same set of design standards? And have to meet green space and setback and bicycle racks that the rest of the building doesn't have to meet? And does that prevent somebody from upgrading their building at all? Because in order to make it match, you have to upgrade it to the new standard. And you may or may not be able to do that. You may not have enough curb cuts. You may not have enough transparency or windows along the front of the building to meet the code. I mean, as I read that and then drove down through Topsom Fair Mall on the interconnecting roads that Dan just talked about in front of the whole mall, and I'm looking at the freestanding buildings themselves going, well, how do you do that? How do you make that work? So how do you make that work? I mean, I assume you thought that through and put that in there and said, well, this can work. So I'm just curious as to how does that work?
You gotta read Article 14, nonconformities.
I did.
Then you have to read it again, and then another times, and then think about it. I found that a little hard.
But when you do that, when you read that section, it means the owner of the property is probably not gonna do an expansion or upgrade.
Yeah.
Because it's too costly. You
Am
can't.
I confused here, because I think I had heard you, Andy, in conversation with some of these folks, I'm assuming, talk about actually creating an example, exactly what Jim is talking about.
In the perfect world, yes, we just haven't had the time. Everybody is so busy, so busy to get to that level.
And of course, there's a cost involved, and
It's not
that
so much the cost.
TDI has some resources.
Not the cost.
Yeah.
it's-
And some cost involved in time. I mean, I joked about the amount of time it took to read this.
Yeah.
Well, I did read it 1.5 times. There's some things I had to read twice and maybe 3 times, and it took days. I mean, it's not like you can just sit and read it and it's, a Disneyland book here. This is complicated stuff that you gotta compare to other pages. And just to take the time to try to figure out the answer to the question. I mean, there's a lot of commitment put into, okay, now let's go apply this.
Right.
Does it actually work?
Yeah.
And that's really. I appreciate what the committee's done over the last couple of years to work on this. And I appreciate that you wanna have development put in the town of Topsom. That looks good and is aesthetically pleasing and has pedestrian and bicycle access and makes us a better community. And I have spent a lot of time going out, checking on some of the stuff and looking at the things that you guys have brought up in meetings, trying to maybe adjust my thinking about something. And I certainly think that I have. But overall, this is starting to get so complex, so pre-designed, which makes it inflexible, that you sit down and read it and go, I don't think that I really want to come to Topsom. And the money that would take me just to figure out if this stuff would work on a site to design it. It certainly doesn't attract me. Now, and I don't think it would attract any other developer. It's certainly not something that's an incentive. Let's go to Topsom. Yes, it's going to look nice when I'm done, but what's that going to cost me? And if Kurt used my line of Cambridge, Massachusetts, because we've been discussing this in our office for 3 days, and I bring up the example, if this was Cambridge, Massachusetts, these design standards may fit in there. Because the density and the infrastructure and everything that's already in place there, this would fit into. But we're bringing this to Topsom. And only really on 3 properties. So we sort of did an inventory of, okay, what exactly are we gonna go redevelop and how does this fit on those particular pieces of property? This is Topsom, and these are my high level comments, then I have some detailed things, but it's very costly. I mean, the roads, the infrastructure, the EV, so that's a new section, the EV charging. Has anybody taken any time to price out what you just asked of a developer to do on those sites? Because you really need to. That alone is a deal killer. I'm on the board of the Lee Auto Group and I build gas stations and, you know, I have about 30 of them. And so we follow the EV industry closely. That is a deal killer with what you're asking developers to do, which, by the way, nobody asks me to put a gas pump at every building that I build. Why as a property owner, is it all of a sudden my responsibility to make sure you can fuel your car when there are people from Kessler and others that are in the business that are gonna build fueling stations around, they're gonna come to gas stations like ours or rest areas or other places, and they're in the business to do that. And you want me to be in the business of doing that, maintaining them? That's a huge problem in the industry, trying to get them maintained. You know, who do I hire to do that? And then you want me to take 50% of my parking spaces and prep them for future EV installation. Somebody's got to price that out. I have a pretty good idea what that costs, and that alone it's probably a cost deal breaker on most properties. It's substantial. Doesn't mean that we don't need a couple and we can't encourage it. But in the state of Maine right now, there's no demand for that. If there was, I'd be building them. I'm the place where people go to fuel their cars, and they're not coming in and not saying, Jim, please put in an EV charging station. We've prepped some of our new Rusty Lantern sites to be big enough to be able to put that infrastructure in the future, but we haven't put the infrastructure in. Because the industry doesn't even know exactly what it's going to be as a standard infrastructure yet. So
That's helpful to hear, Jim. Yeah.
when I look at that and I look at the design standards and I look at the cost, I'm not coming here to do that. There are other places to do projects. It's just costly. I like the fact that you want to design something nice and make it effective and work. We should do that. And I've gone out to the Downs half a dozen times since you guys have been there to look at what they're doing and to compare it. They're more flexible. They haven't said, they may say you need 20% green space and you need to put in, you know, public area, but they let me pick where to put it. And, you know, put the building at the road. Well, I can put it to the right or to the left so I can get my curb cut where I want. The things that you've put in here are not flexible enough for us to build out a site
Can we get
cost effectively. You can do what you want to do by giving us the flexibility to put our park where we want to put the park in the green space. And the parking to the side and to the back. I agree with that, right? Put all the buildings up to the road as much as you can. 3-story gas stations, I can't agree with you on that, but you know, that's what the code's saying. So I can get into specifics of some specific things, but overall, there's an overall ideology here, a design standard here that's not attractive to folks to come to Topsham to try to implement this because of the cost. We got housing issues as it is now. Build these roads and put in some of this infrastructure. We didn't make housing anymore cost effective, that's for sure. Okay, that's my favorite.
I jump in.
And at a certain point, it sounds like we're still at the level of sort of
High level,
review.
yeah,
And when we get the specifics, everybody can chime in again.
Sure, and I commend Jim on reading it very carefully, and I won't pretend that I achieved the same level of care. But I've been looking through the document here and doing some word searches and things like that. And I think at the highest level, it's a push and pull between making sure we don't get monstrosities or things that we're not looking for as a community. And in my personal belief, we should be channeling growth into sort of urban areas, and looking for density in those urban areas. And also overtly avoiding sprawl and preserving the rural open areas. And I think that philosophically, the trade-off is, give developers the chance to kind of go wild in the dense urban areas, and do what they want to do, so that we don't go plow over 200 acres of farm and fields and put, 100 houses or 50 houses there. That's just me. There's others that disagree, and they build the 200 houses in the fields, but that's my personal, belief. And I think it's more efficient, and people love having walkable, pedestrian friendly areas that are near each other. And frankly, some of Topsham and the Fair Mall, it's not really set up for that easily. And I do feel like we might be trying to shoehorn, the downtown Brunswick into the Fair Mall, format, which is difficult. But I think to Jim's point, we're gonna be hoping to do a development here, and we have to pay civil engineers and architects to study the code. And they charge, $200 to $300 an hour. And it does add, 5 figures to cost to big projects if it's very complex and restrictive, and if there's a lot of minute things. In my spare time, I'm a writer, and I've written 3 books. And what I've learned, it's a quote, from Stephen King. It's called "Kill Your Darlings," and it means that my first draft, and anyone's first draft, is not, the final, and I have to go through, and it rips my heart out, but I edit out whole chapters of what I put in the first one, and I cut it down by 10, 20, 30%. And so I guess I would challenge the committee to say, okay, we've got the maximum draft, what can we do to get it simpler? And so there were some examples, where I looked at section 2.8, and why are we regulating roof pitch and type? Are we concerned that a developer is gonna come in and have a roof that's just gonna ruin the neighborhood? And that roof is gonna be too high or too steep, or, I think things like that where, is it really necessary to have a code that forces you to build a certain style? There's already building code. You can't build a roof that leaks, you can't build a, there's already a very complex, multi-thousand page international building code that anyone that wants to do anything in Topsham has to follow without exception. And so I would say, let's not go too far beyond that in this, endeavor. Similarly, like a maximum width of 100. Anytime I see sort of big round numbers, I'm like, well, it's kind of arbitrary, isn't it? Like,
You've given us something specific, would you
Yeah.
zoom in on that?
Yeah.
It's 2.8, I'm
Yeah.
looking, and
Yeah, if we go to 2.8,
is it 2.80?
maybe.
And I'm looking at page 2-13 is where there's a chart, and we're talking about
Let me find where I found it.
allowed roofs.
Yeah, so this is on,
Yeah.
2.80,
Yeah.
which in my PDF, I think is page 2-13.
Yeah,
I think it's 2.80.3, just for everyone.
Oh,
Keeping
okay.
track, it's the chart.
the chart, yeah.
Just
Yeah.
as a note, go ahead, Dave. I didn't mean to
Yeah,
interrupt.
so like,
Line
Yeah.
number 4.
yeah, line number
Allowed
4,
roofs, yeah.
again, if it were me, is it important? Is it worth having there? I mean, it doesn't really, it's probably not gonna honestly constrain me personally, but maybe there's a Japanese restaurant that wants a cool roof, or I don't know, but I don't see that as necessary. And I also think if we're gonna make this trade-off of preserving rural open spaces, I'm a huge proponent of opening up height. And I think we did that in the 1800s when we built tall churches, tall mill buildings. There was no zoning, there was no height limits, and people just kind of adapted to what was needed. And I would encourage Topsham in the dense urban areas to not be afraid of, 4, 5, 6-story buildings. You're probably not gonna get any. I mean, you'd be lucky, in my opinion, if you get a 6-story building, but that is some, I'm a residential, workforce housing builder. I build multifamily housing, and It's all about economies of scale, and I'm not gonna, do you want a skyscraper that is, 500 feet tall in the Fair Mall? Probably not, maybe not, I think there's reasonable limitations, but believe it or not, what we're trying to do, at 4 Union Park, where the height limit is 60 feet, this code would probably lower it to 3 stories, and it would be impossible to do what we're hoping to do there in the future. I think that's something to think about, where I do believe that the key is that the building looks good. And that people are not horrified and offended by it, not that it's an arbitrary number of feet above the average grade plane of the ground. And I do think that if we promote density and allow density, that's a good thing to do. And I think another philosophical thing that I just remembered, to Jim's point, I really prefer it when towns use carrots, not sticks. And so if you could reframe a lot of the mandates that aren't critical as incentives or disincentives, that would give developers a lot more willingness to kind of wade in and say, oh, well, you don't have to build EV charging stations, but if you do, we'll knock $5,000 off your building permit per station or something like that. Hey, it's an incentive, and it's not gonna bar Jim or anyone from we're gonna probably build EV charging stations because our residents are gonna demand them, and that'll be important to our kind of branding and philosophy, but a lot of other people won't or don't. And if we want to encourage that, I would rather not see a mandate. I'd rather see, hey, these expensive sewer connection fees or rec fees or building fees that we're charging you, which are all disincentives to come and build housing. They're taxes on housing. How can we lighten those up a little bit for people that are doing what we want them to do by being green, and dense?
I just want to follow up on one thing there.
Yeah.
Dave, because you're talking, when you're talking about what you want to do on Union Park Drive,
Yeah.
and you said that the height that you need may not be required. So I'm just looking at that chart that we've just been referring to, and that's for the traditional storefront buildings.
Okay.
And so that's a different.
I'm on the
building.
wrong spot for multifamily.
It would be the general
General
building,
building.
which is
Yeah.
2.100.3.
2.100.3.
I think you
There we
still
go.
would have needed a waiver to go higher though for 100 Union Park, which will be altered with what the attorney is looking at with changing some of these things. And I think what you're getting at, Dave, with incentives versus mandates is probably actually going to be somewhat incorporated to get around those waiver requirements. So you all know this, but this code isn't finished. It's getting edited more. That's why we want you here to give these comments. But just to give you that yes, I think initially when we talked, you were gonna need a waiver to get as high as you needed. And it might even become something incentivized.
Yeah, and I think the story height, to give you another specific here, why are we regulating story height? I mean, is someone gonna build 100-foot tall 1 story? I do think that is unnecessary. And when I think about certain buildings that have like a fancy lobby, sometimes it's nice when that's 2 stories high. Is that now illegal in Topsham to have a nice lobby that's over 12 feet? Because per, this code, it would seem to be that you can't go over 12 feet for that story. And again, I'm thinking of what's gonna be a monstrosity that ruins the neighborhood, and I have a hard time seeing the story height regulation as being helpful to that. And so it's another example of, going back to that writing editing process of I would just ask, do we need it? Do we need this? Is it necessary? And can we simplify things by either removing it or making it a suggestion or an incentive rather than a mandate? Because we like tall ceilings, and it might be that you want a 12.5 foot 1 story, and is that so bad?
Helpful, thank you.
Well, in the number of stories is going to be dictated by the number of parking spaces you can get on the site.
100%.
Yeah. And that's another one where I think the way the world is starting to go and the way cars and vehicles are going, we may not all own personal cars in 10 or 20 years. We may just click a button on our phone and it appears, and we're pretty close to that already, So I do think that a lot of flexibility around parking is good, because we as the developers are the ones who are taking a risk if we either build too much or too little parking, right? We're gonna pay way too much money for tons of an ocean of parking that we gotta plow and it never gets used and it crumbles and we gotta repave it. Or we build too little and we run out of parking spots and no one wants to rent our units and we gotta drop the price, or, you know, I think I would, it would be bold, but I would applaud Topsom if you just didn't regulate parking very much.
Or density.
Yeah, or density. I mean, I searched for the word density in here and I didn't find any sections that told me what I could do, which I think is the intent of the new code, which is great.
To allow for greater.
Great. I mean, 3 thumbs up, you know, on that. But you're regulating it in other ways, you know, by the story height, by the max footprint, by, you know, in those sort of things. And I would encourage us to just think like, what is it we're afraid of by getting more housing?
Can I add a couple specifics?
And
in that-
Jim had a.
You know, go ahead, you do yours, then I'll,
Okay.
but I do wanna make one comment.
Yeah.
You said, that, you know, in the future, we may not all have our own car. And that probably could be true. That's a ways down the road.
Oh, yeah.
No pun intended. But you know what? Those cars need a place to park when they come to my business to drop you off. You know, commercial places still need parking spaces. We may not need a driveway at our house if we don't have a car or a garage, but we're still gonna need a place for all of those cars to go when they come to our place of business.
Yeah, and there's probably no one better than Jim and his team to decide how many spaces should that be, you know, at his site. And I'm not saying the town shouldn't have a role in pushing that up or down or something, but with the residential thing, we can get away with fewer spaces than one might think. You know, we wanna, you know, we would want to build about 1.2 spaces per dwelling unit. And some of the bigger 2 bedrooms might get 2 and a lot of them will get 1, and there won't be that many people without a car soon. But it's nice to have the flexibility and not be, the worst thing for us is being forced to build more than we need. Cause it's about $5,000 to $10,000 a spot, we don't wanna do that.
Dave, you confessed and appreciated Jim's approach that you haven't sort of read this thoroughly, but I'm
Yes.
just curious, I hear the comment is very helpful, but did you read in here a mandate for parking beyond what you, because I don't think it's there.
And it may not be, and I'm a bad,
There is
didn't do
another
my
mandate.
homework.
Right,
For parking.
right.
Well, it's actually the other way.
And I went through and started looking again for the mandate for parking, so I'm pretty sure that it isn't in there.
And that's great, I mean, I think that's
Yeah.
really progressive,
Yeah.
that's a smart,
Yeah.
for
Plus a
residential
lot of
anyway, I mean,
flexibility.
that's good.
Yeah,
And
it actually went the other way. You took parking away so that you could only park on one side of the building. So in the case of Sharon Williams, where we park on all 4 sides of the building, there was some language in there that cut the parking down so you could only park on one side. And then there was another paragraph in there where if you have 2 adjoining lots, like Town Fair Tire and the Mattress Firm building is, you can't have the parking lot side by side. So I forget what section that is, but that needs to be looked at. And
so are you saying then that would, that there's required shared parking at that point?
yeah, I mean, you know, at the Town Fair Tire Mattress Firm building, there's a lot line in the middle of that parking lot.
Yeah.
So each lot owns half the parking. And there was some language in there that prevented that from happening. 2 adjoining
It's
lots.
also an issue with the town with curb cuts. So when we deal with MDOT all the time, they're always trying to get rid of curb cuts everywhere. So
Yeah.
when we have 2 buildings, Dan knows this, you got 2 buildings side by side, you put 1 curb cut in and everybody uses it. So they go down the property line and they go to each building.
Yeah.
Well, if I have to move that building over to be next to my side parking lot, I'm not gonna have a curb, and I can't put parking in front of it. Well, I can't do that. So it's a good point, and I had listed that point down as well, that you shouldn't limit that. Cause MDOT's, there's gonna be other issues with other departments and permits and
Right.
towns and other things, with it.
Yeah, there is a conflict, like on 99 Main Street. Tom Errico wanted us to go down to 1 curb cut. Chris, if you remember, in the code here, there was language, and I forget again what section it is, but each property needed 2 curb cuts, so that was kind of a conflict.
One of the things I like that you put in here, and it was in a lot more sections than in the past, was there was some flexibility with the planning board to give a variance. So you set the rule and the standard, but the little last paragraph said there could be a variance from the planning board. So in some of those places you did that, you know, that's like a developer's kryptonite. The last thing we want to do is have to ask for something special when we're getting something permitted, because it's usually somebody there trying to stop us from getting a project permitted. And it's usually an avenue for that, but the more flexibility you give with that, better off this plan will be.
And I'm looking at this chart that we were at 2.100. And there's things that I'm not an expert. So I will, there are probably people in the room that know these things, but I haven't encountered the term building segment before. And I imagine in you know, people like Kurt and Jim and sort of more sophisticated planners encounter that, but it's not a typical term. I don't know what a building segment is. You know, I'd have to study that and learn, but it says in here that it can only be 40 feet. And that, I'm concerned, like what does that mean? What does that do? We may be creating some unintended consequences, you know, of building shape and size here. You know, horizontal shadow lines. That, I don't know what that means, you know, so again, it's stuff that we'll have to be paying, you know, high-priced people to study that may not be necessary in Topsham. You know, there's a courtyard section. Do we need to regulate courtyards? You know, is that key? I don't know, you know, but I don't think we have that many and may not get very many. The number 6, the ground story elevation above grade. Again, I would probably just let builders and the International Building Code and ADA dictate where that is going to be. Does it also need to be something the town of Topsham regulates? Because if I'm near a flood zone, I might want my first story to be 49 inches high and I can't because you're making it only 48 max or 30 inches, you know, so there just could be unintended consequences of getting down into those level of weeds that I think are probably pretty well covered by, you know, existing building code and ADA, but what do you think?
Well, I think, yeah, studying it, what they're trying to do is create a uniformity of street frontages. And the use might change from one to the next, so if it's apartments to a store, and to each his own as whether or not that's good. But I want to pick up on some of your points, if that were the case, and you go to the next building type, the row building block, which is 2.110.
Yeah.
I've never seen these in Maine. They definitely exist and there's a place for them. But if you look at, to your, Dave's point about the building width, so if you have 2 to 4 units, it can be 80 feet maximum width. Or 2 to 6 is 120 feet. Well, okay, I want 6 units and I got 120 feet. My simple math tells me they're only 20 feet wide. Each unit is 20 feet wide. And that seems pretty limiting. So my question is, why be so specific in the control of that? When maybe each unit wanted to be 25 feet wide and they wanted 7 units because it fit nice on that lot. You know what I'm saying? Well, now maybe the planning board can grant a waiver here, but why do we have to ask for a waiver? Why can't we just really talk about some architectural appearance standards and let the units, the dimensional things for some of these work themselves out?
Yeah, it feels like, go ahead, Jim.
Well, I want to talk about 6.6, so if you want to make a comment about what Kurt
Oh, yeah,
said.
I'll say it quick and then we'll go to 6.6. How about that? So, it feels like a solution in search of a problem. You know, because
Yeah.
I guess which row houses or buildings in Topsham have units that are too wide, that have, you know, damaged our visual, you know, landscape. And if we can't think of any examples of a developer who's built, you know, units that violate this rule, you know, why are we implementing it? It would be my thought. Sorry, Jim.
Yeah.
Hey, one thing before Jim takes over, if you look at the diagram, it's figure 2-F, just below 2.70. If you look at that building and the roof lines, there's 4 valleys there. Can you imagine having a sidewalk in front of those 3 doors and having to maintain that sidewalk during the winter with snow and ice and all the water that comes off those valleys right beside each front door? That would just be so much work. The building that we put forward on 99 Main Street looked like a flat roof, but there was 2 feet of pitch elevation difference between the front and the back. We took all the water and dropped it off the rear of the roof in the storm drains and put it into the storm pond. Just saying, that would be a problematic roof for like 99 Main Street.
And the only thing I would say to that, Dan, is, you know, you've got different kinds of building choices, right? And the building you're looking at is the village building. Obviously, that's not a
Well-
building you wanna deal with. Right? There are other buildings, and
Yeah, I'm just making a comment that
But you're deciding that. So the problem is you're deciding that for him. He doesn't have the opportunity to make those decisions because you've limited the building he can put there by your design standards.
and I think.
not only that, but Dawn just told us that getting waivers could be tough or impossible. We looked at the Sherwin-Williams building to put 2 stories of housing on it with an elevator and the landscaping, and I think we needed 3 waivers. And if Dawn's telling me that we're not gonna get waivers easily, I'm dead in the water. Let me give you another example, Topsham Trail Mall 2,
Danny,
the Goodwill building.
Danny, before you finish that, I wasn't saying it was gonna be tough or not tough getting waivers. I'm telling you what the attorney did when he went through it. Talked about, when you talk about waivers, you probably can't waiver dimensions, and he called it dimensional type stuff. So wherever you had dimensional stuff is something that is less waiverable than non-dimensional stuff, right? And I'm not saying it in his terms, but that's the way he worded it. I don't know whether you do or don't, whether it's gonna make it any worse or any better, right? It's just when you're looking at what can be waiverable, you need to understand what is waiverable. And then
Right.
so you can determine whether or not it's gonna be harder or not.
And Don, did I understand the attorney right, by saying, you know, that with dimensional standards, if a quote waiver is wanted and can't be had, that what the code can do is build in conditions that if met will allow for something that doesn't sort of meet the first round, that there are conditions that can be met to allow for something different.
I guess.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Alright.
that is correct. Yeah, I think that the important thing to note is that we want to keep flexibility
Yeah.
within this code. It just may not look exactly like what it looks like right here due to this attorney's review. We wanted to bring you in to review this before we got a new code. The time has been a little weird. I appreciate everyone's understanding of that. With this, but just as everyone's aware, you know, what you're looking at in terms of waivers in this code is probably going to change somewhat, so.
To the good.
Yeah,
Probably.
yes,
I would say so,
absolutely.
yes.
Probably, if I understand it correctly. Ultimately, and I can't say I totally understand. Ultimately, I think we're gonna actually, on the planning board, have more flexibility than less, is the way it's been described.
You know,
Right, so.
That's good to hear.
That's in granting waivers as well, right? So just,
go ahead.
David, one other thing about
Yeah.
this, I don't know what specifically you're referring to in the 40-foot section. But I will say that in our current code, we do, and these guys know it, right? There's a measurement for where you have to have some type of architectural feature, and Kurt mentioned that, right?
Right.
And we've gone through that with Smitty's, we had that flat wall and they're renovating, they had to come up with things that just added something to put a break in that wall, right? Terry Gray on his new building over in Main Street had to do something to put some architectural breaks or whatever, rather than just one flat wall, so that's probably what that is referring to when it talks about segments.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, and I-
Sorry, Danny, I interrupted you, and then we need to get to Jim.
No, and I guess I'm gonna ask this in the form of a question, because I actually just signed a long-term lease with the Goodwill on Park Drive yesterday. And under, Topsham Fair Mall #2, the driveway is gonna be, the drive-through is gonna become non-conforming. And, you know, I might like to add another 2,000 or 3,000 square feet to maybe the front or rear of that building, depending if the need is on retail or warehouse. And I'm wondering if that, because I'm non-conforming, if that could be done, if I came to the board and wanted to put 3,000 more square footage on the front of that building towards Park Drive.
That was my comment earlier about to what degree do those standards apply? And when I go into 6.6, I want to specifically ask about that for Crooker. Because
No.
6.6 states for both manufacturing, industry and extraction, Crooker does not qualify to be there on his own property that he's on now.
Currently.
They won't qualify. But if he goes to improve something, like his equipment, like he buys a new batch plant to sit there, he now has to comply with the new standards according to this. Does that mean that Crooker can't improve his equipment and his property as it is? Because he has to meet these new standards?
I mean, Crooker's
That's a good point.
non-conforming now.
Yeah. But it says when you go to add on, in a non-conforming use,
Right, it depends
like
on the
Danny's example he
percentage.
just gave,
It's not like any add-on, it's if you're adding on.
but is he grandfathered? He's
everything's
non-conforming, but
grandfathered.
is he grandfathered?
Yeah.
And if he wants to add on to his building,
It depends on how much he's adding. I mean, at least that's my reading of it. If you're adding on 50% or more, it, you know, there are some specifics. It's like if you're adding a little bit on, no, you don't, but if you're adding.
so the question is, if he adds 50% on to his building, right, he's got 50 acres there, it's got a small building. He adds 50% onto his office building, he has to now comply on that part. That means he can't add 50% to his office building because he can't comply. Because he's non-conforming. He can't comply. So does that mean Crooker can't add on? He can't add on to a shop out back? Danny can't add on to Goodwill? Panera can't add on without complying? So I think you need to have, I appreciate the fact that new construction and new stuff needs to be designed better, but to take that back and say, if you want to improve the business that you have, you'll be punished for that, or you can't do it. I think you need to have a grandfather clause in here that allows him to be grandfathered. Unless it's scraped down completely and rebuilt, that allows that to happen, or we're not gonna have businesses that can expand in the facilities that they're in, right?
I think one of the limitations of our discussion today is what Guy has already mentioned, which is there are significant discussions that have happened with the town attorney, with the consultants present. And there will be some important changes.
Okay, but I don't know that. I only know what you gave me in comment, so I'm commenting on what you gave me, that's
fine.
all.
I wanted to bring the attention to 14.40.3, which B. When the gross floor area of a building in the Topsham Center zone is increased by 50% or more, so what you were getting at, Jim, there. Any building addition located at or between the minimum and maximum front setbacks must comply with the regulations of the building type permitted in the subject zone, as well as the building design regulations of Article 8. Existing portions of the building are not required to be retrofitted or brought
Right.
into compliance.
The existing parts, the new
Yes.
part does.
Yes.
The old part doesn't.
Yes.
Yep.
Yep.
I agree, which is problematic in itself. It's like, okay, well, what does the business owner do to have a half of the building look designed differently than the old half? So there's issues there. But with the Crooker site being one lot and 50 acres, if he adds 50% to a building, what does that mean to the rest of the property meeting standards, or does it? Or is it just the building we're looking at?
I can't say exactly. I'm not, overly familiar with this. I wanted to look through chapter 14 since this is a concern for you. I don't want to say, yes, this is this, no, that's that. I understand what you're getting at. I think there's a lot of red lines in this section and there's a version that I'm looking at, and the red lines are changes that happened to this draft from previous drafts.
Correct.
So what my understanding is that there was comments on nonconformities and things needing to be altered there, and those were added. I would need to look at it more deeply and probably have Tom Lister look at it more deeply, as well as, you know, everyone else involved with this big project. But I guess I will say that, you know, well, I think the conversation of limiting nonconformities is happening right now. We're hearing it from a lot of people. Sometimes nonconformities probably will happen as a result of this. Crooker is currently nonconforming in the zone. That may just happen in some instances, and we can't make it possible for them to do everything. But I don't want to explicitly say that that's absolutely the case. I just, that would be my guess, that that could potentially be the outcome of something in some cases. I think limiting it, yes, very important, but there may still be some instances that are non-conforming. Yes, they are grandfathered.
Okay, as long as they're grandfathered, because let's not try to improve things and punish the people that have been in our community for the last, 30 and 40 years to not be able to continue to operate and expand their businesses that they have. That doesn't accomplish a whole lot.
Grandfathering is. And Chris, did you have a?
I have some comments that I wanted to make,
Yeah.
relative to, I chose a site, 99 Main Street across the street.
Great.
And just kind of went through the code to see how that impacted our design. Basically, the site, I'll give you some numbers, the site is 4.2 acres in size.
Yeah.
So it's less than 6 acres for the master plan development section that you have there. Our proposed uses are a mixed use. We were thinking of having a grocery component on a main floor and some apartments above on the second floor. In this particular case, I've got a building that's roughly 16,000 square feet for the grocery component as a footprint. And the building along the frontage of Main Street is about 220 feet long by 80 foot deep. So some of the code here doesn't allow for any of that. So I was kind of poking my nose at a couple of items that I'll just run through. Page 2-3, table 2-2. The current zoning map shows BC as a village center zone in this area. Does that translate to the middle village in that chart?
I'm
It's
sorry.
the upper village.
So you're asking what the VC zone becomes?
Yes.
Upper village.
Okay,
Yep.
so I had assumed it was middle
No,
village,
middle
so,
village is existing and it is rather restrictive.
okay, so,
That's-
But isn't this village center here? He's talking about across the street,
Yes,
right?
this is
So this is
village
village center.
It will
Changing the
become
names
upper
again.
village.
okay,
Okay, so we're gonna.
Yeah.
And change the zoning that goes with the upper village or keep the,
When you say change the zoning.
well,
you
we
mean
have
like-
upper.
well, there was an upper village and a lower village on the current zoning
Yeah.
map, plus the BC zone. So I guess I was confused how that applied here.
Because there's upper village, village center, middle village, and lower village.
I feel very silly asking this as the planning director, but can you tell me where upper village is currently?
I
The
thought it
Toyota
was-
dealership, the
there was the
intersection
lower
up.
village by the river.
Yeah,
And
that-
then
yeah.
the second tier was the upper village, and then above that was village center.
You know, I just wanna pull up our current zoning map.
I could be wrong.
And that was
No,
gonna
that's correct. Lower village comes up to the church and the hill. Middle village comes up to the side of the Volvo dealership. Village
Yeah,
center is Volvo to the intersection, and the intersection up is upper village.
I guess my point by making that comment was, if it was middle village and you look at the chart on page 2-8, it only allows for two types of buildings.
No, I totally understand. So it's not middle village. If you look at my screen, I'm sorry, Dan, I'm not sharing this. I can do that if you'd like me to. Let me share. my
It's
screen.
easy enough.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Like, please. So this is our current zoning map. I didn't wanna say something that I had missed for quite a while. So currently Lower Village down here where Sea Dog, the mill is. This is Elm Street right here where the church is. It goes into Middle Village. About the bottom right half of Middle Village is historic district. So that's got pretty stringent requirements on it due to that. And it goes up to, I think,
think that's good ones.
Yes,
That's
this
the
is good
field,
ones
go
right
straight
here.
to the field, the empty field next.
Yes, Middle Village is that, yes, that empty lot
Empty
next to
field.
Good Ones, thank you, yes. Middle Village is rather restrictive, it is now, that's not changing.
Always has.
It's, yeah, it's always been that way, I think that's, you know, what the people of this town want. Village Center is currently where we are now, and it goes above. The Village Center goes all the way up to the border of LI here, and this little bit of R1, so the same zone surrounds 196 and 201 here.
Where your cursor is roughly right now is 99.
Yes, you're right, this is 99 Main,
Right across the street.
this is where we are here. So the zoning at 99 Main is the same as it is across 196. There is not an upper village currently that I know of.
But there's gonna be one.
Yes, so this zone just gets renamed.
We canceled that at the last comprehensive plan.
Oh, well, there was an upper village, because I was on the committee that created the upper village.
Okay,
That's
that
why I
explains
know
it,
what these
I
are, I just didn't know it went
concerned
away.
There was a zone that had existed that
Yeah.
I didn't know about,
Okay,
that
I didn't
explains it,
Yeah, it's limited industrial, that's what.
Okay.
yeah, thank you,
Anyway,
Marilyn.
So VC is becoming UP
UV,
or UP.
yes.
So
I
I,
was not part of that decision, so I can't defend it, I don't know why that
But there's in
happened.
the same boat.
so in that upper village, it only allows for 2 or 3 types of buildings in that code.
Yeah.
And I ask why can't you have a suburban storefront or something that's applicable that the architect works with? If I've got a professional working on these buildings, why do I need all these code restrictions when we say go hire an architect and work with them? I think that'd be the better move.
So which building type would you like,
Well, in
all
this
of them
case, if I got a grocery store
Yeah.
along the bottom,
Yeah.
that's roughly 200 feet long. Where does that fit? Is that a traditional storefront building at that point?
I think
which
it's
is
a general
allowed.
building,
Say that again?
I think it's a general building.
It's not.
Or a
one.
village
But it's
building.
not allowed there, I
Right,
guess.
no, I'm just asking, what do you think, knowing what you want to design, would a general building allowed there allow you to do it?
I think it's more closely related to the traditional storefront or the suburban storefront, but I guess I haven't studied it
The
enough to
suburban
know.
storefront is 1 story,
Why does it have to be 1 story?
that's what a
good
traditional
question.
store, that's what a suburban storefront is, if you want the traditional storefront, if you've got multiple stories. Sounds like that's what you want.
It
Well,
does
you
sound
get
like
a
that.
picture of it on 2-12, the Bull Moose Building. You know, that's what you're trying to create at 99 Main Street. Topsham doesn't have a main street. We ultimately wanted to pull that building up within the 12 feet of the property line so that we could put some outdoor seating and a 5-foot ADA sidewalk. We wanted people to sit out there on the street. And hopefully someday Jim's gonna move that gas station that he's been trying to move. And, you know, the Goodwins own 14 acres there next to the car dealership that's a field. And, you know, if we ever get 99 Main Street built, I'd love to see someone continue building right down to Goodwins, right down to the entrance of their parking lot. And we'd certainly have our Topsham Main Street that would be comparable to a Brunswick Main Street.
So, Chris, carry on.
Carry on, okay,
Yeah.
so I guess I kind of beat that first point to death, but if you could look at the types of buildings in that zone, I think that might be appropriate.
So be
But
more flexible with building.
I think
in
so,
that
I think maybe there's an avenue for Dan in this case, so hopefully that's the case.
That's it.
Minimum maximum setbacks, I'm not really a fan of the maximum setback. It really doesn't take into account the topography of the site, the wetlands on the site, the existing conditions at all. It says you're mandated to put that building in the front, even if that's the lowest part of your site, you still have to put the building there. So how do you handle drainage? How do you handle utilities in those kinds of situations where the terrain drains to the street? And I think that's something that should be considered. Item 3, courtyards. Are courtyards mandated in this code? It kind of
Where
suggests,
are you looking now?
Oh, well, I guess I'm going through chapter 2,
Right.
pretty much.
And I'm just wanting to, because courtyards come up in particular building types. Okay,
Okay, so if we take just one building type in this case, the traditional storefront specific zone.
Yeah.
And it says I'm allowed 75% minimum frontage.
yeah,
Does that allow me my building size of 220 feet? If you look at a village building specification, the maximum width is 100 feet, when I need double that. So I can't do the village building. Perhaps I can do the traditional storefront if I have enough frontage to make that available. It just seemed a bit restricted.
so, and you want to do a 3-story building?
I wanna do a 4-story building.
4-story,
I wanna
okay.
have a commercial use on the base floor and then 3 levels of apartments on top of that. And it appears that from these charts that the maximum height is only 2 to 3 stories. So hopefully that can translate into 4.
Right, so I'm here's some repetition there in terms of height flexibility.
Couple other minor ones. I did talk about the building types in that particular zone. I think it's a little too restrictive, but now that I know that it's not Middle Village, then maybe I was wrong. I did talk about the maximum width, in this case, 100 feet is just too narrow. In the case of my commercial building at 16,000 square feet. And we need 4 stories.
Gotcha, thank you.
And I didn't study the whole code, I just kind of
Yeah, I mean, you're
looked
looking
at
at
this
your-
site
yeah.
just to see how it kind of reacted.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree that we should be getting, bonuses for extra stories, the philosophy of build up, not out. By Chris doing 4 stories, I mean, that's saving trees, that's saving resources, in his site and in Topsham in general. So the general building, in 2.100, which is the sort of biggest multifamily, it lists as 3.5 stories, and I don't know anyone that wants to live in a half story. But what we're planning at 4 Union Park, would be underground parking and then 4 levels, ideally 5 if we were allowed levels, above that. And I don't think it would ruin the town if there were 6 or even 7, so I think the limitations there create unintended consequences. The other idea, I guess, around to think about incentives is, and this is completely self-serving, so, I'll be the first one to admit it, but I'd like some sort of incentive to do underground parking. Not many developers are gonna wanna do it. But it is a great way to, again, save trees, create open space, and keep people out of the weather in Maine. You're saving plowing and salting and so forth. And if you were able to incentivize it with real money in terms, the upfront taxes that we pay, if those could ever be reduced per stall or per percentage of parking, something like that. I mean, I benefit, but I think the town, if other people did it too, I think the town would benefit. It's a really neat, use of space, and it's not that much more expensive than just building the regular frost footings and regular foundations. I mean, it's an extra 30 to 50%, of cost versus a traditional foundation, but it's a great use. And to see, I've never seen a town here in this area actually incentivize those or promote them. So I'd encourage you to think about it.
Lead the charge.
And the other thing that Sky just pulled up was this great zoning map, and that's a challenge that I always encounter when I look at a town where it's like, well, how could I build a project? And I pull up their zoning map, and they're almost universally inscrutable. They're super hard to read and understand. I mean, I'll pick on Brunswick's for a minute, but it's got like 40 different colors, and they're like there's like 5 different shades of brown, and you're like trying to figure out like which brown is my brown. It's really scary and hard. So I would encourage Topsham, like if there can be a super simple, one that's sort of idiot proof on the website where you can zoom in, you can click, And maybe even once you click, get referred to the code and the charts that apply to that zone. Because that's really what people who want to come here and build things want to know. Is like, where can I build what I want to build? You know, how can I get to that answer as quickly, you know, and effectively as possible?
Which, by the way, on that note, I thought your allowed uses in the zones were pretty good. Your bicycle
Yeah.
standards were good. They're probably the best that I've seen in any communities. Usually they're so onerous, it's ridiculous, but it's nice and it's flexible. So both of those were good in here.
I'm gonna jump in real
And
quick.
did I hear Dave say that with underground parking, there'd be no use of salt? That
Well,
that would probably help our urban impaired stream
Yeah.
that we
I
have
did
that.
just make a note about that, Dan. I put a little asterisk in my note thing and I went, oh,
Yeah,
that could,
I thought the
that could
same thing,
connect,
Danny.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that
Yeah.
all of us are thinking the same thing there. I just wanna do this really quickly. We are updating our GIS in the next coming year or so. So hopefully things will get easier. You wanna be able to click, see the stuff
Right.
and maybe go to the code.
And
We'll have
visually,
that.
if you wanna use the same palette, just write it down.
Yes.
You have lavender next to lilac next to purple, and you're like,
I completely understand. I wanted you guys to be aware that
This
that is
guy-
underway.
Scott, be careful and don't update to whatever Brunswick just used.
yeah,
They-
please,
they-
no.
Their own
They,
thing.
they just updated it with something and it's awful. It
Yeah.
used to be the best one in any community,
Okay.
right?
Oh, you have to like get to separate maps, right? Is that what I've heard?
I don't-
Yeah,
I haven't even
Yeah.
figured it out yet. I mean,
Yeah.
I've gotten some stuff printed out or whatever, but it used to be, you go in, you pull it up, you identify it, you get all the different tax cards and everything else you want.
I think we're gonna be going to something more similar to what Brunswick used to have, quite honestly.
The previous version was much better than the
yes.
current version.
I think they're doing their own thing through their GIS person is what
They,
I've
they
heard.
really have screwed it
Yeah.
up.
Well, I can't do anything about that, but we're not doing what they're doing now.
Now, can I clarify just the building heights again? The commercial building, the 3 stories above, that does not have parking underneath. The code used to have incentives to say if you had parking underneath, you can have an additional 15 feet of height, which gave me an extra story. So I could have parking under my apartment building and 4 stories above that for units. In this case, my grocery store case, it's a 4-story building without parking underneath, so it would make sense to show that both of those are allowed.
And you don't mean underground, you just mean under.
Under
Ground level.
building parking,
Ground
yes,
level.
you're driving into the building,
Yeah.
parking under the footprint.
So there wouldn't be like a pedestrian access to the building on the ground floor.
Well, there would be a man door with an elevator
you
or
have to
something
have
like
that.
that, that you have to
But
have.
there wouldn't be, yeah.
One quick thing I noticed as I was flipping through different spots in 7.20.10. When I was working in the nonprofit business and we had, a new child, I would, had a side hustle where we would Airbnb out a room in our house just to make ends meet. And I think it's a really neat phenomenon where average regular people can make a side income, where they might have a rental property that they rent out on Airbnb. And I noticed that in the new code, and maybe the current code, I don't even know, but it says ADUs are not allowed to do that. And I didn't really know why, if that was something intentional. To me, it seems like a great use of an ADU if you're not using it all the time.
7.10 or
7.20.10 is what I had written down, but
I guess my question would be,
Yeah.
where ADUs are allowed everywhere now, would you want in a residential area or an ADU right next to you that's rented out like every 5 days or every 3 days? I'm just asking.
oh yeah, I know, Airbnb brings its own controversies that I think the town can deal with through noise ordinances or, things like that, but to have a blanket, rule where it's just something that I think the town should think about. I don't really have a horse in this race per se anymore. It just strikes me as restrictive in ways that people may not realize or may prevent people from, making use of their accessory dwelling units in the way they'd like to.
The town of Brunswick just did a big study on this, so maybe you could get it, cause I'm on the house, or just got done being on the housing committee in the town of Brunswick with Dawn. And we just did a big study on all of that. and put a rule in place, for no new accessory units can be used for Airbnb or any short-term rentals.
Yeah.
Because that's not the purpose of it.
Right.
The state put the ordinance in place to create housing,
Yeah.
and additional housing for residents, and to not use it all. So they didn't want everybody going out and saying, okay, I'm gonna redo my
Can
garage.
you remember what the
Just for
short
ADU.
term was? Was it 30 days or can you remember what?
It's less than 30. Well,
That's pretty universal.
yeah, no, I should know. But I'm pretty sure it's less than 30 days, and in some cases might be even a little more restrictive. And they went beyond just the accessory dwelling units and are saying that they're putting an ordinance in town to restrict it in neighborhoods, period.
I think,
Because of Andy's comments, Andy.
I was just gonna say, I think what's interesting is you use the word new there, which we don't have in our ordinance, so maybe that's something for us to look at, you know. Potentially something that's easier and it doesn't penalize people that are existing. I know that there's been comments and discussions around this before, so I'm definitely gonna note this down from both of you from both sides on that one.
Yep.
I have a couple of things.
I guess my prediction is
Oh.
only gonna last an hour. Way off.
Well,
Maryland.
yeah, Marilyn, go ahead.
Okay, so I had a few things. On the use chart, there's some things that have disappeared. Really hard to compare them side by side with the things and everything. One of them was, camping, RV parks. Used to be, we used to have that use and it's nowhere to be found in this one. So I was just wondering why that went away.
Just help us to locate the charges.
So the use chart's 6-4.
Can I speak to that one specifically, Marion, but I need.
Missing, it's gone. So what would you do in that situation where a use was missing if someone wanted to do it? Would you find something to put it under? Or would it just be not allowed? It's not really clear what happens when a use comes that might fit in somewhere, but isn't in there.
Is that the only, is
If you were
that
to
the
do
one
that
you were
currently, it
concerned
would
about?
not be allowed.
What?
RV?
I mean, RV, we used to allow them. It used to have a use and it was allowed, I think it was in the R3.
Okay,
Sorry, I was just wondering why it went away. Doesn't seem like
I
anything
think
that would have,
there was a lot of consolidation, cause the
Yeah.
other,
I understand, and I wanna talk about that too.
Yeah.
As, you know. So I obviously have made a big deal out of concrete product manufacturing still being allowed in the L1.
there's no change there.
Right,
None.
Right, so I've made a big deal out of that, so now I'm pretty much the only one who is a subcategory here. So we have high impact industry except as below, and that's me, right? Which sort of, to me begs, I know you wanna consolidate. But in this situation with uses, I don't think that's the right place to do it. I think you want the uses all spelled out in a big list. So that it's very clear what's allowed and what's not, and not a gray area. I think that's the one area where you don't wanna be general. Where you want all those specific things listed. So, I mean, even if you flesh out this list to take your little, descriptions and put everything back in, you went from, I think it was 120 something
Right.
down to 45.
Yeah.
So here I am, and I've had this, I wanna be very sure it's allowed, but this is gonna come up over time where other people want things to be very clearly. So I just think I understand you wanna make it cleaner and clearer, however, I also think this isn't the place, the use chart isn't the place for that. I think you should flesh these all out with all the things that are allowed. Just like you've done with me under high impact industry. And that's just a suggestion from me. I just think that's the one place that it just really needs to be very specific. I don't know what Don thinks about that, but he's the one who's gonna have to be, well, actually, he's not. There's a section in the front of this that says that it's now the code enforcement officer's job to decide if the use is allowed or not. And I was just wondering, whose job was that right now? To decide if,
Uses as codes.
Yeah.
so the
it's
code
codes.
officer has always decided the use, even though it didn't say that in the old ordinance, it was just not in there.
The uses are codes, and then
Okay.
we use the use table
right,
The only time that we can vary is when it's conditional use,
okay,
right?
right,
So it's either permitted or not permitted,
right,
or it's conditional use. And-
Right.
And the codes officer, if he doesn't find something that works.
Yeah.
Right,
yeah,
will at least look at trying to get the chart updated.
yep,
And or find a code that
Right.
use that seems to fit.
right,
Right, and at least segments it into that and then
Right.
corrects it.
which is why we have 120, right, because this is
Right,
everything that
because-
happened back to the
And we
seventies.
Added, cell towers, different things
Yeah,
like that over the years.
exactly. Exactly, so,
If you list everything that's allowed, what happens when something new comes? After it has food, to be either added or.
But
Like a cell tower, when we did.
yeah, but again, uses. Whether
Uses
it's that or
change.
anything else,
yeah,
basically, it's the town citizens that decide what.
right, what's
changes
allowed,
are
what's
to
not.
that, right? I can't make
And-
that change, neither can the
As
code.
long as there's a way to add.
The way to add is to go through the process, correct?
Right,
I have a question for
I-
someone. Oh, go ahead.
oh,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah,
sorry,
go-
I just have a couple more things.
Yeah, go for it, sorry.
Finish.
So, and then I just wanted to talk about I wanna talk about high impact, industry definition again, which is 6.60.3. And so. I do not like how you have this worded, and I wish you'd pull back, like, dangerous materials, hazardous conditions. I just think it's really like, I don't know, I mean.
So
Here,
Marilyn,
we're
are you on
working-
page, are you on page?
I'm on,
6-19?
well, there are no page numbers in the plan, so
Oh.
it's
6.60.
6.60.3.
Point three, got it.
I think it's
Yep,
it's
I'm with you.
6-19 for me.
Yeah.
So. So anyways, it's a use engaged in the basic processing and manufactures of materials or products predominantly from extracted or raw materials, or a use engaged in the storage of or large-scale manufacturing process using flammable or dangerous materials, storage of manufacturing products, and this is the part I really have, that potentially involve hazardous conditions. I don't know, I just feel like you could pull that back, I don't know.
This is the area here where I made a comment earlier, if I can add to it, about being clear on things that are grandfathered.
Right,
Because, I mean, the fear is you're gonna lose your business. Somebody's gonna come
Right.
along and say, we don't wanna have concrete there anymore.
Right.
And we're gonna shut that down because the code says this and it's not
Right.
really clear. And we've had examples of that in town over the
So
past
then
5
you-
years.
right, then you say that sawmills, batch plants, and concrete products manufacturing are allowed uses. And then not allowed chemical manufacturing, commercial tannery, explosive. So currently, right now, we have a sawmill, a batch plant, and concrete products manufacturing in the L1. But you do not have high impact use allowed in the L1, you just have concrete product manufacturing as an exception. So what I'm saying is there's also a sawmill, there's also agriculture, which is not allowed in the L1 right now, but which has been there back to the beginning of Topsham, so, and currently still there with, there is a working farm in the L1.
So. I can't remember.
So, and that's on page 2 of the use table, the second block down, it for high impact and concrete product manufacturing. And then agriculture is just below it.
I think those are great comments. I just wanted to note that the code enforcement officer and the town manager and I did flag high impact industry, not to the extent that you did, Marilyn, but the part that said the following uses are not permitted, we thought was really unclear there, so we had
Yeah.
made notes in our
Yeah.
notes for that to be removed, so.
But then again, if you put that in the use table, everyone would know
Mhm.
what is and isn't, so I don't know. I really think you should flesh out this use table, so it's more clear what is and is not allowed, instead of having to go and fish it out of the definitions.
And if the intention is,
Go
the
ahead.
intention is that those aren't uses, and I'm sure this is part of the intention, those are not uses that you wanna have in the future in those spaces. You
Right,
don't want new batch plants
Right.
coming in, you don't want new concrete coming in, so adding it to the list means that it's, a use that's allowable and a new business could come in. Making sure it's clear under a grandfather clause that it's not allowed for a new business to come into
Right.
the way, but is grandfathered clearly for you to continue to do your.
I wanna be
continue to-
allowed, full allowed,
Correct,
right,
is why that and on the purpose side is important to clarify.
right.
But you need to be careful with the wording there, because typically when something comes to us where something's non-conforming, we can approve something, but we have to be careful because we can't make it more non-conforming, right? So that gets back to the comment you had earlier, Jim, about you had a building that's this big and you wanna add so much to it. That conceivably makes it more non-conforming, right?
Right.
So,
Well, if I'm an allowed use, then I won't be non-conforming
Right,
anyway, so
exactly.
that's why I
So
would like to
this-
be an allowed use,
we need to be careful with
That
the
makes
wording there.
right? I mean, we've always been there.
Yeah.
And I will say, the limited industrial zone, there's very little housing in it, just, the mobile home park. And we're butted right up with the highway and the schools. And that is the absolute best place to be, because we don't have any neighbors and no one ever complains about what we're doing. Not with the cows, not with the batching, which isn't really that noisy, but we just don't get any complaints. It's a great place to be. And so if there were to be more type of business like that to come, that would still be a great place to be.
The highway.
The highway makes more noise than everything. So the school makes a lot of noise. A Sunday afternoon out by my mom's pool, there's backup alarms constantly, and they're trying to train new bus drivers, so. Anyways, I think that was it. And I would just like to, one more time, just make one final plea, that you put out some sort of document to highlight the changes in this new document. I do think you will have a problem at town meeting if you do not do that. I think people will be so confused about what the changes are that I think it's gonna cause a problem down the line for you when you're trying to get this. And I mean, we're not we're obviously have interest, so we're looking really hard at it, but you're gonna have, the town, the select board, you're gonna have multiple future groups looking at this and who don't know how to read zoning. They need the changes to be, picked out, so. Even if you just make a list. You don't have to make a red line, make a list,
I had a question, and this is probably from not having read every word through. Maine, I've heard, has the highest adoption of heat pumps of any state in the country thus far. Norway's gone about 70% heat pumps. We're putting them into almost every new building we do. And we had a unfortunate situation where the ones that power really big systems, called a VRF heat pump, the condensers for them are not a little box that is, barely noticeable on the side of a building. It's like a 12-foot towering, structure, and it hums and makes noise and so forth. That had we known, we would have sited either in a different location or ideally up on a roof, which is where a lot of mechanicals, are kind of best suited to go. And I'm just wondering, in the code here, are those allowed up on roofs of the different building types? And does that affect any of the height or story limits that we have? And how do we deal with that, if at all, in the code?
In here.
Okay.
Where is it?
Yeah, I searched for the word roof and there's 141 examples of it,
Well,
although some of it is proof.
You gotta do like the discrete.
Rooftop mechanical equipment,
Yeah,
8.40.3. Any rooftop mechanical equipment such as, but not limited to, vents, ducts, condensers, blah, 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 not including salt, shall be incorporate the equipment into the roof design consistent with the applicable standards in 8.20. Set the equipment back a minimum of 10 feet from any street or public way. That's fair, I guess. Painted to blend with the structural roof and limit its, I don't know about C. Nobody paints these things. In fact, that could void a warranty or something. You don't paint a heat pump condenser. I've never heard of such a thing. So that might be something to strike. And then I'm curious to go to 8.20 to see what the design standard is that we have to comply with, but
I had a question about that whole treatment of utilities too, in terms of heat pumps. And not being visible from the street or inside or the basement. There's a whole lot of restrictions on it. I thought, well, where do you put them? Most people's heat pumps are kind of like right there and it's screen them. And eliminate the prohibition.
Yeah, off to the side somewhere.
But if you have apartments, each one might have its own unit. And then, but you only have units on the backside. So it's just something I do
That's
think
something, yeah.
takes a little bit of
Utility section.
look at.
Yeah, to me, I would urge the town to only legislate condenser visibility and location in like a historic district. But maybe not, just let people, because we don't want them to look ugly. I mean, we want our customers and residents and everyone not to be living right next to a big, condenser fan or,
Right.
In general, but it does feel like there may be some unintended consequences of, it's like, oh, well, we can't do heat pumps in this building because it doesn't fit, with the code, and I don't think that's what the town would want.
Into 8.4 mechanical.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, there's certain distances and lengths that you can have your condenser away from your heat pump. So if you put it in the back of the building, you might not be able to service the front part of your building. So a lot of times.
The front, and if all the parking is put on the other side, isn't?
No, it's not.
and just on that note, as you look at 8.4, page section 810. You show some of the green utility boxes by the road and that's not allowed, that's a decision of CMP. That's not a decision of us as a developer. We don't get to go hide those somewhere and allow that. I mean, I don't think that could happen. We can't hide those boxes.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, I highlighted it also here. I say no power for you.
Yeah, well, they already don't give us power when we need it, so
We try to hide them at Highland Green and they cut them back.
they took our fences down around
Yeah.
it. We hit them and they said, no, that came and took the fences down.
So you can't even have a gate like at a dumpster? I know
No.
they need access to pull fuses.
They wouldn't allow it. If
Really?
you look at Brunswick where Bar Harbor Bank, Dunkin' Donuts and the medical building is, there's a green box sitting there. And we have a nice wrought iron fence the whole length with plantings, except where that box sits. They took it out, even though they could get to it from the other side. They said, yeah, no, you can't limit our availability to that, and they took it out. So.
I have one more.
I have one more too.
Okay,
Go ahead.
it sounds like we'll be able to end at 3:30.
Yeah, I don't think mine won't take long.
Yeah.
Mine won't either.
Mine's under 2.4.1, the minimum streetscape area,
3.4.1.
page 2-6. Like 40.
Getting there, getting there.
Yeah,
10110.
yeah. The minimum streetscape area.
Yep.
It's defined, or it says it's between the edge of the street pavement and the lot line. Which, to me, that's the right of way. So, it's talking about having minimum streetscaping in the right of way. And then the image below on the next page, 2.7, it shows existing street right of way, and then within that, you've got the street trees. And I don't know any public works person that has ever allowed us to put street trees in the right of way. And if they were, who would maintain them? So I think that should be revisited.
Usually the sidewalk is just, well, if it's a town, Brunswick, I see the sidewalk and then.
The sidewalk, yeah.
And then you get the sidewalk and then the streets and then the pavement, all within the right of ways.
You sure about that?
Where your sidewalk is right on the right of way line, there's a 12-foot setback required in that section, a minimum that you'd have to have. On our side.
I don't think I've had trees in the right of way in Brunswick either. The sidewalk,
New trees,
but then the
we've
trees,
never- the new trees that they just planted in Brunswick on Main Street. Between the sidewalk and the pavement and the parking.
okay, well, that's a very wide section.
It is.
200.
I'm thinking more like
But it's still.
Landing Drive or something. I'd have to look at Landing.
It is pulled
Right.
down, but I don't think it's in the right of way.
We had trees planted at Mallard Woods in the right of way and they made us pull it back, dig them up and pull it back because it was too close to the sidewalk. So that's another.
Anyway,
And we shouldn't have to plant trees under power lines.
Right.
We always cut them. I mean, somebody comes along, we do it to meet code to get our building done, and then 6 years from now, they come along and cut them all out.
Good point.
Put it on the other side of the street with open.
Marilyn?
You're fine too.
Go ahead, Marilyn.
Okay, so in the question and answer you gave us, I had a while ago asked a question about the requirement of open space subdivisions in R3 that's in the farm and open space tax program. And you answered that there was only 5 and they all have conservation easements. So does that mean that that's gonna be taken out?
It's gonna be looked at, because the fact that that's a requirement, it raises some questions about that, so that's why I wrote also the planning board needs to look at that,
Yeah.
because to me, there isn't a clear,
Right.
like, this is this and that is that. The fact that those, the assessor requires properties under that tax program to have a conservation easement, which suggests and potentially even prohibits, and just cautious about always using concrete language. That you wouldn't even be able to subdivide it, so I'm not completely
Yeah.
sure what was gotten at with that one, so I wanna look into that one more.
So maybe I have this wrong, but the Hunter Farm is in, we're grandfathered because they were in this program so long ago, where part of the farm is farmland and part of the farm is tree growth.
Mhm.
And they don't do that anymore with the mixing. But there's no easement to my knowledge, so maybe, but I think it's the same program, the tax rate
Maybe
is
he had that
similar.
one missed, I checked with the assessor and he gave me like 5 or 6, but I will say that that's not going in the way it is.
Yeah.
Your question made me look at that and go,
Mhm.
there's something going here, I don't know exactly what's happening, I don't know what the intention is.
So that was a change that came from the planning board then?
I'm not exactly sure what
Where that
change,
came from?
yeah, happened from, but, you know, when there were significant changes happening outside the Topsham Center zones, we mostly tried to put them towards the planning board, because potentially they happened due to cleanup, potentially they happened due to other things. I am the 4th planning director to work on this project.
Okay.
I want you to be aware
Yeah.
that needs to be looked at more, and thank you for bringing it up.
Okay, thank you. I mean, cause if we did develop that, the part of the Hunter Farm, it would be, I wouldn't want an open space subdivision, I would want something potentially more dense that like fit in with Bay Park, and not a big fan of giving the land away anyways, but that's it.
I got one more quick point.
And then Jim will finish us out.
I'm sorry, Jim.
No, go ahead.
We're on site coverage. A couple of the zones are very low. In particular, I'm thinking of the mixed use limited zone, the 40% site coverage. We had an issue at the Topsham Dental Arts facility. We got approved recently. Our parcel was relatively small, 1.2 acres. We put a building and parking on it. We're 80% plus or minus, which is what the previous code allowed. I wouldn't have been able to build that building if this project wasn't part of the Highland Green project and a planned commercial development, which kind of superseded that requirement. But in other sites where it's not related to Highland Green, they're kind of stuck. 40% is not a lot. You'd have to have 3 times the land to get the same building and parking. So I ask you to take a look at that. 40% just seems really, really low. I think 65% is really, really low.
Yeah,
So.
So anyway, I've already asked someone to look at that.
Oh, good. Give it a minute.
So.
Well, This doesn't help us reduce the sprawl we're trying to reduce.
Right. I used your email to.
Okay.
I'm aware of the issue, I think that those were come about because of what the existing floor area ratio and open space ratios were, combined with Julie, looking at specific, like she tried to find some of the most sprawly, on the word, lots in those zones and kind of get an idea of, you know, what the lots with the most coverage in the zones were and go from there. It seems like that one may have just been it doesn't match what
Somehow.
it needed to, it got stress tested, we're looking at it.
Somehow there was an unintended consequence, and I asked her to go ahead and look at it.
And it was in the MUL and then the middle village, I saw it 65%. Man, I don't know if I can make that.
That's pretty middle.
Even in the residential, it's a little small for some of the house lots, you know, the smaller ones closer to the edge. I did a calculation for someone recently and it was tight. And when you get that small and you're trying to do it on the Google, it like with the points, it's not super, it's
Mhm.
kind of hard to get
Yeah,
it.
we're
You know,
working
I
on
could
that
make it go
one.
5 points either way, so.
Yeah, it needs to be, looked at.
Yeah.
Dawn is right, we already held a workshop on that, I've been so busy lately.
Okay.
We're working on that one.
Okay, last thing. And this, I think this is a big deal, so it's why I left it on my last thing to talk about. And it's the master plan development, so 2.140. 2.140.2, number one, when you talk about designing a master plan development. And it says, you know, engineering is not required for approval of a master plan development. But then you go over to project phasing B, project phasing and guarantees. So when you submit, when we submit to you now for that, we need to include, you know, all components, utilities, street, parking, open space, landscaping, building types, all of it, including financial guarantees and prove to you that we have the ability to do it, because that's what it says, such as financial guarantees must be included to ensure completion of all site components. So over here, you're saying you can really come in and it kind of can be kind of open. And over here, by requiring that, it means we need to have all, you can't even get that from a bank at that point in the process. You can't do that. That just wouldn't happen. Because this project's too big. You're asking for all of it, right? And then down below on number F, you talk about abutting parcels. If I don't own the land next door, and you want me to assume that I can come up with what the development plans would be for that land for the next 10 years and have to include it in my development plan? Well, how am I supposed to do that? I mean, the guy next door might have a farm and goes, I'm never selling you my farm, Jim Howard. It's gonna be a farm forever, right? So how do you do that?
Without having the right.
And I don't have control over it. That guy has control over it.
And you
So,
might have 10 abutters, right?
yeah, how do you do that?
Yeah.
And it also says that the planning director can, upon his own opinion, decide what other land to put in that you have to now look at in order for your development plan. Well, how, I mean, how do you do that?
Can we go back to your first question? It was, you do the master plan.
Yeah.
Now you're gonna do phase one.
Oh, well, you
Was
got,
it just phase one that was referring to, the whole thing?
Can I jump in really quickly? I think it is trying to say that it is asking you to tell us what type of mechanism you would use, not to actually furnish a performance guarantee. But I would agree that the way that it is written is confusing, but that is my guess of what that intention
okay,
is.
if you can clarify it, that I don't have to have it.
No,
I'm just gonna tell you I'm gonna go
absolutely
get a bank
understand.
letter.
Well, no, but there's sometimes is an issue with, it's helpful for us to know that you want a letter of credit or you wanna do an escrow account or this. I don't completely know, I don't wanna say, yes, this is exactly what this is, but the fact that it says proposed mechanisms to me kind of implies that it is.
It's not locked in.
You're not furnishing it, you're saying which one you'll use, which I don't wanna comment on why that's there, if it should be there. Any of that, but that's my guess on what it means there, just as a note to you, I think we should look at it, I've taken notes all day today. We're gonna get this looked at, like all of it,
So this will have an answer.
we're gonna look into it, yeah,
Okay, so it's,
Yeah.
if you clarify it that way, then.
I agree with you, the language there is a little bit confusing, yeah.
And one last piece of that, why would you not, this is such a big project, and the codes and standards you've put together are so complex and costly. My biggest worry about this whole thing is the cost of it. Can anybody actually go build this and have it be affordable? Right? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but why can't we phase this? If the Crooker site, for example, which is the site that's gonna fall under the master plan development, it's 50 acres. And you want me to design up 50 acres now? the money that I would have to put up front to do that, just the soft cost to design it all, why can't I take 10 acres of it?
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thank you.
Thanks for your work on
I
this.
think that's how it's done other places, how you're describing
Well, yeah,
phases. I
but-
think that's pretty.
But why
typical.
can't I take 10 acres and say I'm gonna design 10? Because I've gotta be able to put in the first round of infrastructure to get to the second phase, the third phase, the fourth phase.
I understood.
You want me to design,
I didn't read
I mean, I
that.
think that you need to have a general idea of what it's going to look like, because the idea
Don't
is to
engineer
not.
it out.
Not engineered out, and if it's still reading that way, that is important information that we need to have. But that the idea is that, you know, if you have a large parcel, and yeah, of course you can't develop all of it at once financially, but we would just wanna know where the roads are gonna be, you know, so that you don't
For a
have.
concept. of
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, like, you know, okay, we're gonna do, you know, two roads going straight this way, there's gonna be 3 going in between, you know. Just so you don't say, okay, I wanna do 10 acres in this style with like a curly Q kind of development, and then the other one is street grid. It's just so that cohesively it can come together, but I think, and I know when I was in meetings last year about this, the intention was not to have it engineered, the intention was just to have something that said, okay, these were about where the roads are
A
gonna go.
concept, a
Yeah.
okay,
concept.
so you,
Conceptual
so
plan.
we can phase it then.
Yes.
You can,
Yeah.
I mean, I think at the beginning, if it was a master plan, you would need to have something, I'm not saying engineered drawings. That says, so say for the Crooker site, you would, you know, you'd say, okay, I'm gonna have a road come off of 196, it's gonna go up to 201. I think I'm gonna have a feeder road go off of that, or, you know, I don't know exactly what happened there or anything, but you would have that very basic sketch. And then you would say, and for now, I'm just doing the 5 acres right next to 196 and 295. And you wouldn't do anything with the rest of it engineering, you would just have that concept. And then you would design that 5 acres and then you'd say, okay, I'm gonna do the 5 acres. That's between that one I just did and 196 in the eastern border, you know, and then you'd engineer. So it really wasn't meant to be a financial burden upon you, it was just meant to be that large lots, Crooker would cohesively fit together due to the long, I think, timeline of building something
okay,
like that.
well, I read it to be that plan had to all be put in place.
Absolutely, and I hear you, and I'm
Maybe
making
you
a note of
should
that.
add in a little
That's
concept
almost-
plan
It sounds
section.
like we need to make it clear, and that is great information.
And like
so
just
thank
whatever
you.
you actually want in the concept, like clearly listed.
And my reason, Jim, that I understood it differently, I was in a meeting with a consultant who explained it. You just weren't at that meeting. I mean, the CPIC has a lot of meetings, and I think we hashed that out, but not in front of everybody.
Okay, well, if that
Yeah.
gets cleared up, then I'm good.
Do we need to show buildings and parking, or can we show bubbled areas of this is a development area 1, development
That's
area
sort
2?
of
Not necessarily design it all. You know?
It's not engineered, but it is more
A
than.
concept
more
design.
concept.
Yeah.
More
Yeah.
So it's a
what you're
vision,
saying.
a vision.
Do I need my
statement.
concept to
Okay,
show
all right.
5 buildings and
No.
parking,
I
or do I
misunderstood it.
say, this is where I wanna develop these
I
3
think you
areas?
would wanna
in a
say
row?
probably, you know, if you had like. Mixed use residential or just residential, these are gonna be this type of, you know, and. It's, you know, I'm hearing that there's questions about this, I think. I think roads and utilities are a really big aspect of this, just cause in planning, it just, and luckily, I don't think we've had this happen too badly in Maine. But in other states, there's just a whole bunch of subdivisions that abut each other that have no way to get in between them. And interconnectivity is just, you know, something that we think about a lot. I think this is that, it's just trying to make sure that doesn't happen on these large parcels that might get developed, which I'm not saying anyone was planning on doing that necessarily, you know, I know that you guys say that you wanna make things nice and stuff, but I don't wanna say like, you know, I think that's just what this is getting at.
But you know, in town, just on that note, in town, we have neighborhoods that are just like that.
Yep.
And everybody comes out and prevents the town from
Connecting.
connecting them together
That's
because they
right.
don't want more traffic through the neighborhood.
That's right.
They do the absolute opposite.
I know.
Yeah, I know.
And they all show up to the meeting?
That's right. All 12 of them. Thank you.
all.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan.
Hey, thanks you guys. Thanks for all
Dan.
your comments.
All the other
Hey,
towns-
Scott, I just, one last question. I mean, there was so much information that was going back and forth that it was, I think, really pertinent stuff.
Okay, no problem.
How
Things are
are we
great.
gonna make all these changes?
Let me see if I can,
It's now 2025.
Sounds good.
give me 1 second, Dan, I just
We're
couldn't hear you over
not-
the hubbub, just give me 1 second and I'll answer your question, I'm gonna need you to repeat it.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're good, what was it?
So, I mean, what I've heard here the last 2 hours was some real good information. And I take my hat off to you and Susan. How in the world are you gonna implement all of these changes? And all this wordsmithing that needs to take place between now and town meeting?
It's not going this spring.
It's not gonna be this town meeting.
Yeah, we've pushed the timeline out because it's such a big, Susan. It's such a big project that we wanna make sure it's done right, and we're not rushing something through that isn't ready, to stress you guys out.
All right.
I think Susan
So-
and I haven't talked about this, but we'll probably get the comments together.
Yep.
And then they'll be passed on to, we'll probably CPIC will talk about them. We'll flag things that would need to go to the planning board. I'm gonna have Mark, I'm gonna ask him to watch this, actually, he asked me to record it. So it's gonna go through those normal channels and then it'll get passed on to the consultants and stuff, so. This was, I think, a very productive meeting, and I appreciate you and everyone else being
No,
here.
I think it is too. There's a lot of great questions that were asked that are real risk for property owners that have been doing business for 25 plus years. So,
And it's expensive to develop right now with regulations the way they are, so I hear you guys on that, I really do.
okay, thanks again.
Yeah, you're welcome, see you, Dan.
Bye.